feel about dogs? Since COVID, I've done most interviews for this show remotely, connecting via laptops. But for this week's episode, when my guest was writer Carvell Wallace, we decided to just do it at my house with my dogs and some snacks.
Cool. This is such a great spread. Oh, that's so sweet.
Yeah. Would you like some tea or coffee? Or fizzy?
Carvell Wallace is someone I first got to know as a writer and from his podcast voice. His reported pieces in the New York Times Magazine became appointment reading for me, for his insights and also his beautiful writing. I also listened to podcasts he made. There's one called Closer Than They Appear. There was a series about Mr. Rogers called Finding Fred, a podcast episode about long-distance love from the show The 11th that was among the most intimate portraits of relationships I've ever heard. And over the years, he and I have gotten to know each other a little. He lives in Oakland and I live in Berkeley. We've had a few coffees, sometimes text. And when I joined Slate, we became coworkers. He's one of the co-hosts of the Slate podcast How To, and has also written for Slate's parenting column, Care and Feeding. But another reason it felt right to talk to Carvell at my home, we were going to get into some intimate territory. He wrote a memoir called Another Word for Love, and it's a gorgeous book, one that I passed on to my neighbor as soon as I finished reading so she could appreciate its writing. And it's also about tough things. Carvell writes about his childhood of moving in and out of living with his mom, periods of homelessness, being sexually abused as a kid, being shamed about queerness and gender fluidity before getting to know those parts of himself later in life. He also writes about fatherhood and money and art and finding different forms of reconciliation with family after years of strain. But in our conversation, I wanted to dig in with Carvell more about romantic love and sex. And we do. We talk about sex parties, lust and Shakespeare, masculinity, and how he's trying to own up to past mistakes.
We have so much trauma and damage through the very unhealthy way that our society deals with sex. And I think that if it's treated with care and connection and honesty, and if you feel safe and the person you're with feels safe and you create safety together, then it can be like a rewiring of your brain. Like, oh, actually, I don't have to be in danger in order to be loved.
This is Death, Sex, and Money. The show from Slate about the things we think about a lot and need to talk about more. I'm Anna Sale.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Whether you're selling a little or a lot, Shopify helps you do your thing, however you cha-ching. From the launch your online shop stage, all the way to the we just hit 1 million orders stage. No matter what stage you're in, Shopify's there to help you grow. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/special offer, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/special offer.
When we talked, Carvell Wallace and I sat in my dining room in 2 chairs catty-corner to one another. There was a copy of his book, Another Word for Love, on the table. I want to start by having you read a sentence to me that I loved.
A sentence?
It's on page 153. Will you read that sentence to me?
Love is simply the feeling that I am grateful to be here, and I'm grateful you were here too, even if you are on my fucking nerves, which, to be honest, some of you are. You like that one?
Does that sentence feel like an important sentence to you?
Yeah, I think it's important because it's a meditation on what love truly is, as opposed to what we're taught it is. So you can love someone that you don't like. So I think that's an important thing. I think the other thing that I like about that sentence is that it addresses the reader. It's unexpected. And I do think that one of the bigger projects of the book is to capture the experience of being alive. So I think part of doing that is capturing that there's no difference between humor and earnestness, that they're not They're not mutually exclusive.
I am a sucker for humor alongside earnestness. They need each other. And Carvell's writing delivers this range, and his attention to detail keeps you anchored. For example, early in his memoir, he describes a night in 1982 when he and his mom were kicked out of the house where they were staying. It was the middle of winter, and they had nowhere to go.
That was the first in my mind about this book, almost like 10 or 11 years ago. I knew that I was going to start on that night because I was aware that something had happened to me that night that like would sort of like mark the shape of my life. And so what happened was my mother and I, we had been evicted from the apartment that we lived in. And so we were kind of bouncing around from place to place, but we stayed with my mother's sister, who had like a pretty nice house in the suburbs. To me, it felt like a mansion. When I was a kid, I thought every house was a mansion. I didn't know, because it was always apartments for me. And then my mother and her sister got into some kind of like argument, fight, and then her sister kicked us out. And it was the night of a snowstorm. And we had this car, this sky blue Pinto, license plate EDG 178.
No way. You remember the
I do
license
remember
plate?
the license plate. We also named the car. Her name was Susie.
Oh.
And so we got into Susie, and my mother stormed out and, dragged me, and we got in the car. Anyway, the car wouldn't start. She like couldn't get it to start. And I just remember just feeling the overwhelm of like responsibility for life in that moment. Like I was a kid, but I was like, oh, wait, life isn't like fun and games. Like, this is serious. We don't have a place to go. We don't have food. This car won't start. It's freezing.
And there's a moment you describe when your mom's trying to start the car and it won't start. And you describe her body over the steering wheel. Is that an image that you remembered from when you were a child?
I don't know anymore, actually, because what's interesting about writing something like this is that I know that I'm an artist and that my responsibility is to tell this story, but I also know that who knows what memory, I mean, I don't know if I actively remember. I know the things that I know I remember. Like I know I remember that it was February. I know that I remember that the car wouldn't start. I know that I remember we went to a Long John Silver's. I know I remember the house of the dude who we ended up going to that night. These things I know for a fact. And then I think I remember, I do remember my mother crying. I think I remember the way her body was shaped. I do know for a fact that I remember the way the streetlight was in her hair. There was like a glow, like a gold sort of like haze around her hair through the streetlights. But then I'm 50 years old, or almost 50. So it's like, at this point, how would I know? Like, unless someone built a time machine, I could go back and see that night. I would never. And there's so many things that I've learned that I either don't remember at all. Like I, would like reconnect with someone I went to college with, and they'd be like, "Remember that night?" Blah, blah. And I'd be like, not only do I not remember that, like that, as far as I'm concerned, that never happened. Or we'd be like, I remember me and an ex were trying to figure out why we broke up, and we could not remember why we broke up. And I was like, weren't we in Washington Square Park? Like, no, didn't you cheat on me? No, I didn't cheat on you. Didn't you fall in love with your roommate? No, not that. Like, we don't even, and at the time, these were like the biggest things that ever happened.
Yeah, the things that changed the plot.
I have a lot of respect for how unreliable memory is. And I think the thing about writing memoir is that you can combine your visual memories with your emotional memories, right? So you can't say that things happened when you know for a fact that they didn't. But you can say, I remember how it felt, and I can describe what I think it must have looked like to create that feeling for the reader.
And you said Long John Silver's, that's where you drove
Yeah.
when the car started. And that's where you laid your small body down.
Yeah.
And you describe looking up from the vinyl seat and seeing the gum under the table.
That I do remember. That's a detail that is burned into my brain. Because the thing about your core memories is that, things that change your brain chemistry make a bigger, longer lasting impression. And so these moments where something is changing heavily inside of you, they do sort of like leave a scar. So one of the things I've learned about details is that they're neutral. They don't mean you any harm. And so if you're in a situation that is traumatic or painful, or you're being hurt, sometimes I like rely on the details, the sound of the bird outside, the way the paint like is swirled like under the window, because it's a safe place to recover myself. You know?
Do you think your skill that you developed of collecting and paying attention to details because of some of the things you went through as a kid, do you think that's part of what made you a writer?
Maybe. It might be part of what makes me a good writer. But I do think that, you know, everyone's got a different response to trauma. So I never feel like it's sufficient to say, well, this terrible thing happened to me and that's why I'm this way. It's like, I was this way and that's why this was my response to these terrible things happening to me, right? So someone else might have a similar set of things happen to them as I did, and they might like completely dissociate and never pay attention to details.
Another detail you mention is what it was like to listen to music when you were first falling in love with music.
Yeah.
And you describe listening to Michael Jackson.
Yeah.
And can you tell what you noticed about the song? Do you remember this line?
Yeah, I do remember because I had this. So it was Michael Jackson mania. If you weren't there, I don't know there's any way to explain the level of obsession that people had with Michael Jackson in 1982, 3, and 4. And so I ended up coming into possession of some like, you know, scammy, like greatest Jackson hits of some like small record company trying to capitalize on like, you know, his explosive fame. And so I don't remember the exact song order, but I remember, you know, it was like chronological order. And so you had, you know, like ABC and all these stuff in the beginning. And then as he gets older throughout the tape, and I remember feeling his like voice change and like, and then there was Dancing Machine. And I would often play that tape when I cleaned my room, and which I did on Saturdays. And then because I had pretty bad ADHD, cleaning my room would take forever because every time I would pick up a toy, then I would just, you know. And so I remember I would start my room at the beginning of like young Michael Jackson. And then by the end of the the day, the sun would be setting and Michael Jackson would be older and his voice would be different. And there'd be this other level of intensity there that always made me feel melancholy. So I remember Dancing Machine, that there's like towards the end, he's like vamping over the fade out. And I remember the way his voice was like reedy and sensual. It was so different than like the young, you know, there was something sad about a person growing up. There was something sad about him growing up. And for me, like receiving that, there was a melancholy about it. Probably because I associated growing up with having bad things happen to you. And so on this tape, I felt like somewhere in my body understood this progression of like from childhood to like adulthood, which means that from innocence to like lack of innocence, from wholeness to harm. It's like I could feel it because that was my story. So maybe that's what I projected onto him. I don't think I realized that until just now.
Wow. And it was a routine.
Yeah.
So is that Pittsburgh era?
Mm-hmm. That was like right after I moved to McKeesport, which is a small town outside of Pittsburgh.
When you moved to Southern California and you're back with your mom, you tell everybody in Pennsylvania that you're going out to LA to become an actor.
Yeah.
And then you get into theater.
Yeah.
Sure enough, living in Southern California.
Yeah.
How old were you when you started reading Shakespeare?
We did a production of Romeo and Juliet when I was 14. Or no, we didn't do the production. We did scene work from Romeo and Juliet when I was 14. So that was my first ever encounter with it. But soft foot light through yonder window breaks. It is the east and Juliet is the sun. I learned that monologue from the balcony scene when I was 14. But my junior year, we did Winter's Tale, which is a very obscure and somewhat disliked Shakespearean production. And it's magical realism. It's one of Shakespeare's few, people don't even really know how to categorize it. Anyway, we went through the language of that text, like line by line by line, for the entire semester. And I learned a lot.
And did like close reading Shakespeare, did it give you a broader vocabulary for understanding the variety of feelings that one could have and could try to express?
Well, I think the first thing I ever realized about like understanding Shakespeare or appreciating it is that Shakespeare seemed to have written about every possible feeling a person could have. And that's the first time I was like, my mind is blown by whatever this entity is who wrote this. This is incredible.
Like, what's a feeling that is there one that you remember being like, I didn't know that had a word or a name, or that was a phenomenon that other people experience?
It was the complexity in which simple things were explored. So like, I think of Juliet's monologue, Gallop apace, you fiery-footed steeds, when Juliet is waiting to, Romeo and Juliet have this like misunderstanding where they try to abscond together, but then people, so they're going to fake their deaths and then they're going to run off, but then one horse is faster than the other and then they think And so there's this one moment where she's like waiting to get word that everything is going according to plan, and she's waiting for the horses, and she has this monologue that begins with the line, "Gallop apace, you fiery-footed steeds." And I remember thinking about that line over and over and over again because it captured her. It was like, this is supposed to be a play about love, but it also captured the anxiety of love, like the feeling of helplessness in love. And I did not encounter a lot of work that was like that. All the other work I encountered around love was like, I love you so much. I love you so much too. Let's be together. Baby, you're my baby. Let's be my baby forever. Or I'm sad that you're not my baby. Please come back, be my baby some more. But this one was about, you have everything you want, and yet you're terrified. And there's a lot, and even that reading, if you just look at the terror through Romeo and Juliet, that's a really interesting way, I think. And I haven't looked at the text in a long time, but I remember when I was more into it thinking, that would be an interesting way to direct this show and direct these actors, is like, what if the underlying feeling was like anxiety and terror that you were going to lose this thing? They barely got what they wanted. And they know they're going to lose it, and they do. That level of complexity I had not encountered elsewhere by the time I encountered it in Shakespeare.
Oh, that's so beautiful. Like that feeling of like, I recognize the preciousness of having found this, and I so desperately want to hold on to this feeling of not.
That's right. Of not looking for this anymore.
Yeah.
And in a way, they weren't even really looking for it. That's the other thing that's interesting about that play. Like Romeo was kind of a douche. Like had just fucked someone else, and then he kind of threw her to the side, and he just like was running around, And so he wasn't like, I've got to find someone. He wasn't like on the apps looking for someone. They just encountered one another, and they were both blown away by whatever was going on between them. And there's something also about the fact that we're taught that when love comes, there are answers. Like everyone's like, I need to find someone. Everything will be great once I find someone. And then these people find someone and everything falls apart immediately because of the fact that they found someone. That's just good storytelling. That's just good plot.
Damned if you do, damned if you don't. And if you can try to go back to teenage Carvell, taking that in, like when you're thinking about these ideas surrounded by other students, like were you talking about what you were recognizing?
No, you know what it is? I don't think I had words for that then. I just knew in my body that there was a layered way that stories were being told in this text that was like exciting to me, and that I mean, to answer your original question, it just showed me that it was possible to tell stories this way, that the way that I experienced things, which was complex, nothing is fully good, nothing is fully bad, that was actually, that I wasn't the only person that went through the world that way, that this entity, whatever Shakespeare was, some many hundreds of years ago in a whole nother country was also seeing the world that way. And so that made me feel not alone. So I don't think I had the words to like analyze it at that point. And I think at the time I felt a lot of intellectual inferiority, probably having to do with racism, where I felt like everyone else must know stuff that I don't know. All of these white kids must understand stuff that I don't understand. And so I don't really know what to say about this text. And I'm afraid that I'll say the wrong thing and the teachers will be like, that's wrong, go back to the ghetto. You know, like this was my anxiety as a kid in that scenario. So I didn't trust really my insight, but I did know what I felt. And the fact that I could work that out as an actor was helpful because acting is physical. Even though you do some intellectual work to get there, in the end, it's a physical job.
Coming up, Shakespeare notwithstanding, Carvell talks about the miserably narrow education about men and sex that he got from the rest of pop culture.
I remember specifically learning that this was the way men are supposed to be, and there's no problem with it because it's all fun and games, and everyone secretly thinks it's funny.
It's the dog days of summer, but the news, it keeps coming at us. There has been so much to take in just in the last week or so. But I want to suggest you listen to an episode of Slate's daily news podcast, What Next? It came out on July 4th, and it's an interview about the Supreme Court decision that recently voided a settlement with the Sackler family, the family that ran Purdue Pharma and aggressively marketed OxyContin, even as its addictive and deadly toll became clear. Under the terms of that voided settlement, the Sackler family would have contributed $6 billion, but the family would be immune from future lawsuits. What Next host Mary Harris talked with Cheryl Dwyer, a mother who had 2 children die as a result of opioid overdoses. She was part of a team of people who negotiated that settlement deal with other family members and also states and insurers.
I watched the verdict come in and was so taken aback by it. I was not expecting to react the way I reacted. It was a sucker punch, and I felt like I had lost my 2 kids all over again.
In Cheryl's view, getting significant settlement money to communities and individuals quickly was the top priority to prevent future deaths.
Putting the Sacklers in jail is not going to help that piece. Getting their money might help save some lives. And that's what it's all about. They created this epidemic, and now, the last day that they're on this earth, they're going to have to stand before the ultimate judge and get what's due them. And I'm counting on that.
Other families who've lost loved ones to opioid overdoses saw it differently and agreed with the Supreme Court that immunity for the Sacklers should not be part of a settlement. Some families on that other side were at the Supreme Court during the arguments, and Cheryl Dwyer told Mary Harris that even though they were on different sides, afterward they went to lunch together. You can hear the full episode in Slate's What Next podcast feed. Do check it out. And a reminder, I write a weekly newsletter where I share other things I'm reading and listening to, and also what we're hearing from you about our episodes and what's going on in your life. We make podcast episodes here at Death, Sex, and Money, but the most special part about what we do is the ongoing conversation we're having between all of us. You can get that newsletter by going to annasale.substack.com to join in.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Whether you're selling a little or a lot, Shopify helps you do your thing, however you cha-ching. From the launch your online shop stage, all the way to the we just hit 1 million orders stage. No matter what stage you're in, Shopify's there to help you grow. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/special offer, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/special offer.
Hey, I want to take a moment to encourage you to follow Slate's daily news podcast, What Next? Part of why we at Death, Sex, and Money were excited to join Slate was because we were becoming a part of a network of podcasts that are smart, not too self-serious, and they really work hard to bring good, thoughtful news and stories into the world. And that's exactly what Next does. I bet a lot of us are starting to feel many emotions leading up to this year's election and about the state of the news in general. And something I think you'll appreciate about Mary Harris, the host of What Next, is that she's warm, incisive, and open-minded as she interviews. She and the team cover stories you haven't heard before or offer a different side to stories you might feel like you already know about. She speaks with experts, and she also really digs into the stories of the people who are living the headlines we're seeing, which is so important. I hope you'll take a moment to follow What Next, Slate's daily news and analysis show, available wherever you like to listen to Slate podcasts.
Have you ever wondered how to be the funniest person in the room?
Or how to actually change someone's mind?
Yeah, what about how to find your people?
Or even how to have the best sex of your life?
Ooh. Well, then if you have wondered about these things, then you probably need to check out Slate's podcast, How To, hosted by me, Carvell Wallace.
And me, Courtney Martin. We're best-selling authors, fancy, and journalists who love finding solutions to problems, which is exactly what we do each week on How To.
Listeners call in with their toughest questions, and we talk it out with them and some of the wisest people we know.
It's like free group therapy, and everyone's invited.
We share stories and advice that's not only surprising, but even life-changing.
I feel like I'm afraid to jump, but this has been super helpful because you have helped me trust my wings.
We're all in this together, so let's help each other out. Look for How To from Slate wherever you listen to podcasts.
This is Death, Sex, and Money from Slate. I'm Anna Sale. Carvell Wallace was a teenager in the 1980s and trying to get a handle on sex, what had happened to him as a kid when he was abused, and what he was supposed to do to initiate as he became a man. The information available to him wasn't great.
We're taught about sex in specific ways from like very early age. All TV shows have some things. I write in the book about like watching this scene on an episode of Happy Days is actually what it is, where I think it was Joni was on a date with some guy who was like handsy, and he was like chasing her around the couch, and everyone was laughing. And he was like, your mouth says no, but your eyes say yes, which was a cliche. It was a meme, actually, in the 70s and 80s. Your mouth says no, but your eyes say yes, which is horrifying.
I'm giving you what you really want, because
Yeah,
I can tell.
That's right. That's right. And that's another big thing, is that the idea that sex is supposed to be a thing where you know what, especially if you're a guy. I don't know if women experience, people who were raised and indoctrinated as women experience this, but as a guy, I was like, you're supposed to know what she wants, like at all times. Consequently, you never ask. Consequently, your guesses may be wrong, but if they're wrong, you just soldier on because you're trying to like be in charge. You're trying to like be decisive, you know? So I remember learning that specifically from that episode. I watched a lot of Three's Company growing up, which was, you know, another show that had like very specific stuff about sex that was sort of left over from the swing 70s idea. But it was like the idea that like men are constantly interested in sex, and like, you know, their eyes just pop out of their head every time like a pair of breasts becomes visible. And it was all like lighthearted, like jokes, you know? And so the problem that I had growing up is that I didn't relate to those feelings necessarily. They didn't, as the older I got, the more sort of like disenfranchised I became from this stuff. But there was no way for me to be.
There was no other script.
There was no other script. And the women that I would interact with as friends, oftentimes, not even as sexual partners they'd be so different from like the women in movies that I'd be like, huh, how do you explain this? I don't really know what to do now because you seem like a person.
And there's another line I want you to read for me. This is on page 170.
Okay. Sex is weird and disgusting and ridiculous and quite often abused and weaponized and traumatic, but I still like it. I like what it can be and sometimes what it is. Sometimes I think it might hold the secrets to almost everything. If we can learn how to treat it with care, we may be able to heal every part of us that needs healing.
I stopped at those words and thought, I've never thought of sex as having the capacity to heal. I think of it as raw and carnal and this element of danger that gets us close to our most animal parts.
Yeah.
What did you mean by that?
What the hell are you talking about? Even the carnal thing that you described, I think of that as a potentially healing experience because it allows us to be fully present in the realm of senses. There's obviously something really powerful about sex, obviously. And so I'm curious always about what that is. But even what you describe as the carnal, animalistic, slightly danger adjacent aspect of it, in a very basic way that I think all the kink people have sort of figured out, is that if you create proper guidelines around that, you can then visit that space, experience the catharsis or emotions of it, and then return safely from that space. And in this way, you have like reunified some aspects of your humanity that may have been separate, or you have reconnected or had reunion with aspects of your human experience that you may have been separated from in your daily life. I think that's all potential. Yeah.
I like that. I think it broadens how I think all of that is possible with cuddling.
Yes. All that is possible with cuddling.
and then to think of like, no, you can be a little broader, Anna.
Yeah, it's true.
Okay, so I want that potential. And in order to create the conditions for that potential, it takes skillfulness, right?
Yeah.
Can you tell me about what it was like to go to the sex party that you describe in your book?
I've gone to many, like it's not an unusual thing for me. I do sometimes, but prior to that, I hadn't been to any that were specifically for people of color. And so going into those spaces of intimacy in what were almost always like overwhelmingly white spaces was like, okay, there's only so much of this I can put up with. I can't fully enjoy myself here. And so in spaces, so I was really excited for the idea that when like people were like, okay, let's make one that's just POC. So I think that was exciting to see what that was about. It was, very heavy on, the possibilities versus the expectations. That you think of the space as like a place where there's a lot of possibility, but there's not a lot of expectation. Because you could potentially get there and be like, gee, I kind of don't feel like doing any of this stuff. And that and this is another reason why sex can be a healing space, particularly for people who've had their boundaries violated and who have then had to work over the course of their lives to rebuild healthy boundaries, is that potentially if they say, as they said at the beginning of this space, like you actually don't have to do anything that you don't feel like doing, it's like that on one level, but there's a much deeper level on which you actually don't know that. Because you're like, well, what if I'm in this space and everyone's doing sex? And then this other person that I've sort of been flirting with and have decided that I want to do sex with wants to do sex. And then we get started and then I like suddenly get like this very subtle feeling like, I'm not sure if I want to do this. But I can't say no now because it'll be weird and they'll be offended and they'll feel rejected. And aren't I just being a stick in the mud? And maybe I should just like all this stuff that happens. I think what was really interesting about the way the culture of this space was set up was that, no, that little voice is actually the most important voice.
And at this particular party, was this done in a more intentional way than you had been a part of before?
Yeah, for sure. Because before I had just been to a couple of like swingers clubs, which are whatever the opposite of intentional is. It's that.
Okay. The opposite
Whatever
of
the polar opposite of
intentional
is.
Clumsy and unthinking.
It was that, yeah.
Okay.
And they're super hetero, and everything is just, it's just like it's just like not, And so it wasn't like, once the initial sort of like salaciousness of like, oh, look, some titties, like is gone, then you're like, I don't think I really like this. This is not really for me. I would like another kind of experience that I don't, like, I don't mind it being a group experience and it being a sexy space, but I don't want it to be this. So I think that's another thing that was exciting. Like, oh, here's another way that there can be like a sexy space that you can be a part of, and it can be safer somehow.
And what in particular about the way that the culture was described, like, felt new and interesting to you?
Well, yeah, I think the idea that you should listen to that little voice that's like, I'm not sure if I want to do this now, that was kind of a new thing culturally for me. And they even went a step further and were like, actually saying no is a way of taking care of yourself and doing everyone a favor. Huh. And actually, if someone says no, typically you might be like, thank you for taking care of yourself.
It doesn't mean you're a prude. It doesn't mean you're disappointing the person or hurting them.
Yeah.
Which are all these things that we're taught.
Yeah. I think I might say in the book or somewhere that sometimes you don't know you believe something until the moment you find out it's not true. And like one of the things that I didn't know that I believed is that sex was, I felt, an obligation, especially if you got to a certain point with someone. All these external pressures that like force you to override your core sense of self. That's the running theme in all this stuff for me. That's what I learned to do growing up. And I found that sex was a place in which that was really active. And the idea that there could be sex in which that wasn't active, and the question of what would that sex be like? What kind of experiences would I have if that wasn't one of the qualities of sex, has been a really interesting and exciting question to pursue.
And what did you notice to be talking about these sort of shared guidelines for interacting, and then what it was like to be at the party where there were only people of color, where there were no white people? What did that open up? How did you feel that?
Well, white people are, as a collective,
it's okay.
As a collective, they're kind of distracting, like, because you're always like waiting for someone to do something fucked up or say something fucked up to you. Like there's the objectification, there's like the weird assumptions, there's the weird way that people like, you're hyper visible in white spaces, but then it's like your body is hyper visible, but your humanity is invisible at the same time. It's just exhausting. And it's just like, sex is already weird enough, and it's already odd enough that I'm like trying to like have a conversation while these two people are butt fucking like 30 feet from me. Like, can we just take one element out? Can we just lower the level of difficulty just one notch?
And how that evening unfolded for you sounds so sweet.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There is, I mean, this is the hill I will die on. The answer to the question of one of the things that's on the other side of sex that isn't the result of momentum or internal coercion or external coercion.
Momentum.
Is that you can do sex things that seem really wild and out there, but that feel really wholesome. And sometimes we do sex that's wild and out there because we want to feel deeply unwholesome. Like, it's just dirty. I just want to do the nastiest fucking thing. And that's can be its own high. And that's fine. But I think that sometimes we do that because that's the best we think we can get to fully go there. And so it turns out that, like, what if there's this other way that you could do sex and many sex acts that seem surprising to people and have it be really wholesome and loving, as wholesome as cuddling. What if that was a possibility? And so I think that night, what was wholesome about it was that we just, to use the Adrienne Marie Brown quote, because neither of us were internally or externally coerced, we moved at the speed of trust. Mm-hmm. And it created an experience that we collaborated on together.
The word wholesome. Mm-hmm. What a word. Mm-hmm. It's not judgy. It doesn't have to be a judgy word.
It doesn't have to be a judgy word. It's amazing. There really is something else out there for sex that I did not know was out there until I started questioning this stuff. It's like wholesome is cuddling, and then sex is supposed to be dirty. And it's like, no, you can
Dirty's
do really
hot.
Dirty stuff.
Right.
Yes, that is really hot. and also it's wholesome. Yeah.
Hot and wholesome.
Yeah, it's hot.
Whoa.
And the wholesome part is the feeling that you don't have to then make your way back to normal life after that. You don't have to be like, oh my God, what have I done? Because that feeling when you're
come up out of a dungeon.
Yeah, you're doing all kinds of fucking kinky shit, and you're just and then afterwards you're like, what the fuck what was I doing? It's so weird. And that is great and fine, and also that transition doesn't have to happen. You're like, oh, I don't have to become someone else in order to fully have a completely overwhelming sexual experience. I don't have to transform into a different person. It's pretty amazing.
Coming up, Carvell talks about a sexual experience in his 20s that did not move at the speed of trust.
Her saying to me, I'm disappointed in you. It was such a clear sentence, and it struck me so immediate, because it wasn't like, you suck. It was like, I didn't think you were the kind of person who would do this. I had higher hopes for you.
In 1978, gay people in California faced a dire threat.
Proposition 6, the Briggs Initiative.
The teaching profession is riddled with the homosexual element.
John Briggs is going to fire every gay and lesbian school teacher in the state of California.
I'm Christina Cauterucci. This season on Slow Burn, we'll explore how a nationwide backlash against gays and lesbians led to a massive showdown in California.
This was tens of thousands of pissed off gay guys and lesbians roaring down Market Street.
With so much at stake, young people became activists.
We've got to fight back. We can't let this happen in California.
And activists became leaders.
My name is Harvey Milk, and I'm here to recruit you.
Slow Burn, Season 9, Gays Against Briggs. Listen to the whole season now, wherever you get your podcasts.
You also write about part of learning about how to have healthy, wholesome sex is from making mistakes. Mm-hmm. Will you take me back to what you write about in the book? You're in your 20s, is that right?
Yeah, I would think 21, maybe.
College?
Yeah.
What happened?
Well, I had this ex, and we had broken up, and it was kind of messy, the breakup, but we were still sleeping together because we were in our 20s, and she was had lost her apartment, or for some reason was living in I don't remember why she was in my place, but she was staying with me for a few weeks while something else happened. And then we were sort of having sex during that time, but sometimes not. And then this one night we were in bed, and I was trying to convince her to have sex with me, and she was like, no, I don't want to, but it felt like in touching her body was she was really wet. And I thought, well, this is clearly that thing where a girl says no, but secretly she wants to, which is a thing that I believed was a thing because I had been told my whole life that that's a thing.
And her body is communicating to,
yes,
to
right.
you.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And so I kept trying to convince her. And eventually she relented, I guess. And as soon as it was over, she was like, I'm disappointed in you. I remember those exact words.
Hmm.
And I was like, what do you mean? She was like, I said no, and you kept like insisting. And it was only in that moment that I was like, oh, wait, that wasn't a no that meant secretly yes, but I'm playing this game with you. That was actually a no. And how could I have gotten that so wrong? Like, I know that I was not probably a great boyfriend to this person, but I also loved them and didn't want to do things that hurt them. And I just felt shitty. I just felt like a shitty human being. And I felt really confused by how I could have gotten that wrong. And we, like, our relationship, like, we maintained our relationship in all these different ways. And we broke up and went separate ways. She moved, I moved. And then at some point a few years later, I like reached out and was like, listen, I'm still like I'm really sorry about that again. And she was like, listen, not a big deal. Like, so many things happened and I'm sorry for this other stuff that I did. So it was like kind of like resolved, but it wasn't resolved because it just that whole exchange kept echoing in my mind. Maybe it felt like there was something really important there that had to do with the kind of person I wanted to be versus the kind of person that I was. Mm-hmm. Like, there's a difference between who I saw myself as and who I wanted to be and what my actual behavior was like. So when I wrote that chapter, I was really nervous about writing it, obviously. And I like reached out to several writing mentors and was like, here's the situation. What do you think? And everyone was like, well, you should write it and then you could decide later if you want to include it, but you should definitely write it. So I wrote it. And then I sent it to her. Like, I reached out to her. We hadn't talked in like 10 years.
Oh, wow.
A long time. And I reached out and was like, listen, I want to talk about something that happened a long time ago. And would you be open to a phone call? And she was like, yeah. And so we got on the phone and we caught up. And I like explained what I was undertaking. And she like, there were two really odd things about that phone call. One is that before I said anything, she immediately was like, I've been wanting to talk to you because I've been wanting to apologize for something. And the thing that she apologized for was a thing I had no memory of. None. And I was like, I don't even remember that, but thanks. And so then I was like, well, this is what I want to talk about. And she was like, I don't even really remember that. Uh-huh. She was like, that sounds kind of familiar, but I don't think so. And we both realized that the reason we didn't remember the things that happened is because so many worse things have happened to us at the hands of other people that this was like way down on the list of things.
Though for you to think that you could be a man or a person who could do that kind of harm to somebody else was horrifying. That stuck.
Yeah, it did. And I mean, it wasn't horrifying because I'm so shocked. It was like, how do I undo this?
Because
like,
you didn't mean to.
No, I didn't mean to. But how do I, and I still did. So how do I undo this? Like, for real, for real. Yeah.
And what do you think?
Well, what I say in the book is it's a lifetime of indoctrination that gets you to that point. So it will take a lifetime of recovery to get away from it. And so I can't single-handedly undo all the misogyny and patriarchy that led to that moment. I can only live every day in a sense of practice around trying to deal with all of it to whatever extent I can. Writing this book is like a big part of that. It's like, let's talk about this. We can't recover from things until we look at them clearly. Let's look at them clearly. But I don't expect myself to ever be fully free and done. I do think that there is a really strong drive to truly love people. And it's like, you can hurt people when you love them, for sure. But part of the reason love is so important to me is because it's a lifelong practice that is multifaceted, that you never graduate from like learning how to love. And it can be a very useful antidote to the ways in which systemic oppression has taken root inside you. Because there is an inherent conflict when you love someone and yet you're complicit in their harm. And you have to resolve that conflict somehow. And so for me, one of the main things that motivates me to do the difficult and perhaps sometimes scary work of, dismantling my own parts of like oppressive systems is the love I have for people in my life. I don't want to be a part of a system that harms them. So it's like, that's the work I have to do. That motivates me. Other stuff doesn't motivate me. Being a good person no longer motivates me. It used to motivate me, but it never did, because it wasn't being a good person that motivated me. It was like everyone thinking I was a good person motivated me. That turns out there's a dead end to that street. And so, so it's not the motivating factor. For me, the motivating factor is like, I want to care for and love the people that are in my life that have cared for and loved for me.
That's Carvell Wallace. His memoir is called Another Word for Love. And there are links in our show notes to How To, the podcast he co-hosts at Slate, and the writing he's done at Slate. This episode was produced by Cameron Drews. Death, Sex, and Money is produced by Slate. Please support the production of our show by becoming a member of Slate Plus. You'll not only support our work at Death, Sex, and Money, you'll get access to benefits, including listening to us and all of the great podcasts Slate makes, including Carvell's show How To, without any ads or sponsor breaks. To subscribe, just click Try Free at the top of the Death, Sex, and Money show page on Apple Podcasts, or visit slate.com/DSM Plus to get access wherever you listen. The people who make Death, Sex, and Money with me at Slate are Andrew Dunn, Zoe Azoulay, and Cameron Drews. Daisy Rosario is our senior supervising producer at Slate. Alicia Montgomery is Slate's head of audio. Our theme music is by the Reverend John DeLure and Steve Lewis. And if you're new to the show, welcome. We are glad you're here. You can find us and follow us on Instagram at DeathSexMoney. I write a weekly newsletter. You can subscribe at annasale.substack.com. And reach us anytime with voice memos, pep talks, questions, critiques at our email address, deathsexmoney@slate.com. We love hearing from you. While Carvell writes about many grown-ups who disappointed him as a kid, there were role models, like the woman who lived down the street from him in L.A., who gardened and paid him and a buddy to wash her car. She was, Carvell writes, quote, the first genuinely cool adult I ever knew. It was like she knew the world was trash, nothing was that interesting to her, but still, kids should be treated with kindness, you should still dress with some flair, and it was important to tend to your rose bushes. And, Carvell writes, he later found out she was kind of famous and had one big radio hit.
Do you know her song?
I do know her song. Everyone knows her song, but I'm never going to say what it is.
You can say.
No.
I want to know so bad.
Never going to say what it is. I decided that when I was doing this, when I wrote this book. I'm never going to tell anyone. But yes, her song was everywhere.
I'm putting out love for her in the universe, even though I don't know exactly where to target it. I can just, what a cool image to get to have for you. Mm-hmm. I'm Anna Sale, and this is Death, Sex, and Money from Slate.
For years, you asked yourself, how do I save more money? But now it's, how do I preserve my money? Someone's asking the right questions. And at Sandy Spring Trust, we'll answer them one-on-one. From asset management to legacy and estate planning, you can feel confident in what's to come. What's your next financial destination? Visit sandyspringbank.com/wealth. Wealth and insurance products are not FDIC insured, not guaranteed, and may lose value. Wealth products offered by Sandy Spring Trust, a division of Sandy Spring Bank.